Here are various books, various other objects
To
as
je
well.
neke koje ste vi pisali i neke koje ste uređivali, jel?
That's absolutely right.
Robin Harris rođen je u Falmouth, luci u Cornwallu, s dugom pomorskom tradicijom, u čemu možda možemo tražiti korijene njegovog početnog interesa za Dubrovnik. Studirao je i doktorirao povijest na sveučilištu u Oxfordu. Kada su godine 1979. konzervativci na čelu s Margaret Thathcer dobili izbore, postaje vladin savjetnik za politička pitanja. Tada i počinje bliska suradnja s Lady Thathcer, a kada je ona godine 1990. napustila Downing Street, učinio je to i Robin Harris. No suradnja se nastavlja. Piše govore, članke, uređuje knjige, piše biografiju. Povijest i politika i dalje su, kako sam kaže, njegove najveće životne strasti. Što mu donosi više zadovoljstva, a što ga više može razočarati?
I should say that my political involvement has never been at the front line. I've been an advisor to Mrs. Thatcher and to the Conservative Party and to the government. So it's not like quite being a member of Parliament, but it's still full of heartbreaks. It's still very frustrating. And you never really know when you're involved in political activity whether it's going to bear any fruit, even in the most obvious sense of actually winning elections or not. Whereas, of course, when you're writing history, and as long as you're conscientious and you're not stupid, you ought actually to be able to write some interesting history. So it's more satisfying, and it's certainly less emotionally disturbing.
Ovom prilikom za nas su zanimljive 90. godine, kada ste zajedno sa gospođom Thathcer napustili ste 90. Downing Street, ali 91. zapravo vi ste ovdje vodili jednu usamljenu bitku za istinu o Hrvatskoj. Rekli ste tada da ste možda prvi ne Hrvat u Londonu koji se borio za interese Hrvatske.
And I remember I was looking up just the other day, on the 6th of October 1991 was the first public demonstration for many years that I'd ever been on. And we had this demonstration in Trafalgar Square. 1,000 Croats and Slovenes and people turned up. And I stood up there and represented Mrs. Thatcher. And it was actually in your Croatian report of it, because I said, I'm ashamed to be British. And I've never said that before. And I hope I'll never say it again. But I was ashamed, because at that time, terrible things were happening in Croatia. We didn't know how bad they were. I mean, I didn't know how bad things were in Vukovar, for example. And I didn't know the following month it was going to fall, but terrible things happening. But I knew enough. And I knew that injustice was allowed to go on. And if you allowed injustice to proceed without saying anything, let alone doing anything, without saying anything, you were complicit in injustice. And Mrs. Thatcher and I, though I don't know, we're different people, different views in many ways. Both of us have quite a strong sense of justice.
Zanimljivo je kako je u kontekstu tih događanja, kako ste došli na ideju da počnete pisati i kako ste se odlučili da počnete pisati knjigu o Dubrovniku. Naime, vi ste rekli da bi se istina o Hrvatskoj mogla bolje saznati, potrebno je upoznati se s njenom poviješću i kulturom.
The crucial thing to show about Croatia was that Croatia is a Western-oriented society. It's part of Europe. It shares our values. I mean, that doesn't mean you should behave disgustingly to people who don't share your values either. But it should mean more to you if they're your people, people who share your values are being affected. And so, in the longer term, goodness me, over many years, it finished up with my writing about Dubrovnik. And I chose Dubrovnik, if that was what I chose Dubrovnik because I am an historian and I am a medievalist, actually. And of course, most of Dubrovnik's great period is in the medieval and early modern period. Also, Dubrovnik has a continuous history. As you know, Croatia has been broken up into bits which sometimes were part of Croatia and sometimes weren't. And also, practically, that meant that the archives for these different bits of Croatia, some to be found in Vienna, some to be found here, but actually, of course, Dubrovnik, it's got these incredibly rich, continuous archives, so I didn't find any difficulty in deciding Dubrovnik was the society, the bit of Croatia to study.
Svoje istraživanja o dubrovačkoj povijesti Robin je Harris započeo ovdje, u modernom zdanju čuvene British Library. To je razumljivo kada se zna da zbirka knjižnice sadrži oko 25 milijuna knjiga, a najimpresivnija je kolekcija manuskripta i povijesnih dokumenata koji datiraju čak do 300 godina prije Krista.
I started here, and also they have some very good collections of older books. So, for example, two books that I read here were Jakov Lukarović's Copiosa Ristretta, which really deals with Dubrovnik in the 17th century, and Francesco Maria Appendini's Historical Critique, which is again very important indeed from the early 19th century. But although they've got a lot of books here, they didn't have enough books. So it was necessary also to use another very important source in London, which is the library of the School of Slavonic Studies. And that, again, has an interesting history because it's based upon the papers of the great Slavicist R.W. Seton Watson, who was a champion of the Slavs within the old Austrian Empire, and indeed was heavily involved in the setting up of the original Yugoslav committee and so on. And his papers form the center of a great collection, which really does include most of the Croatian literature, for example, Držić, Hektorović, all this sort of stuff. And, well, that wasn't enough either. So, of course, it was necessary to go not just to Dubrovnik, but to Zagreb. And I spent September 1996 in Zagreb, and that was just after the opening of your spanking new glass-covered biblioteca. And unfortunately, quite a lot of the books in moving from the old library to the new library had got lost and put in wrong places and so on. And also I discovered that, unlike here, in Britain almost everything is centralized. But in Croatia, you don't actually have all of your sources in Zagreb. So I had to go back to Dubrovnik because the reading room in Dubrovnik contains many printed books that they didn't have in Zagreb.
Osim što je koristio povijesne izvore u londonskim knjižnicama, Robin Harris je naišao i na punu suradnju i pomoć mnogih Hrvata koji žive i rade u Londonu. Među njima su bili i Krsto Cvijić i tadašnji hrvatski veleposlanik Andrija Kujaković.
Mislim da smo kao Hrvati i Hrvatska imali veliku sreću da u Robinu Harrisu imamo jednog historičara od formata, nekog koji je profesionalno studirao povijest, iskazao se već na tom polju i koji se odlučio baš za pravu temu, a to je Dubrovnik, grad koji je bio toliko osporen, toliko su ga drugi svojatali i on je napisao prvu knjigu koja situira Dubrovnik u Hrvatskoj. To sam ja smatrao jednom velikom zaslugom njegovom, još danas to smatram, da je krenuo već od te točke i to mu je dakako pružilo mogućnost da osvijetli Dubrovnik puno bolje, puno točnije nego razne druge povijesne knjige i drugi povjesničari koji su sa raznih strana išli, imali neke svoje planove kao recimo i susjedstva da se Dubrovnik preuzme od Hrvatske i mislim da je to on izvršio izvrsno, profesionalno, nije napravio nikakve koncesije, a usto je to zapravo bila jedna mala povijest Hrvatske na svoj način.
Gospodine Kujakoviću, vi ste ne samo ovdje u Londonu, nego i u Dubrovniku bili svjedok nastajanja knjige.
Pa ja bih želio početi od vremena kad sam upoznao gospodina Harrisa, kad smo zajedno putovali sa Lady Thathcer u Hrvatsku i tad smo se zbližili i gospodin Harris mi je rekao da bi želio napisati knjigu o Dubrovniku i ja sam kao Dubrovčanin bio više nego ponosan da mu mogu pomoći. Bila je to dio jednog projekta gdje sam ja samo držao jedan od stupova i želio što više doprinijeti. Tako gospodinu Harrisu ne samo o organizaciji, nego sam i ponudio stan gdje on vrlo rado prihvatio, bio je blizu arhiva i koristio ga je nekoliko puta. Kao Dubrovčaninu meni je to bio ponos da gospodin Harris kao Engles piše knjigu o povijesti Dubrovnika. Jer smatram da to nije samo povijest Dubrovnika, nego je to povijest i odnosa u regiji i Hrvatske kroz povijest Dubrovnika.
Evo za nešto manje od jednog sata
bit ćemo u Dubrovniku.
A, dobro.
Recite, kada ste vi prvi puta bili u Dubrovniku?
Prvi put u Dubrovniku je bilo 94 godine, ožujak. Našao sam grad, novi grad za mene, ali grad koji je vrlo tužni, bez turista, bez novca i mogu dodati čak bez budućnosti. I to je bilo neugodno za stranac, ali ja sam bio tamo za istraživanje u arhivu i to je bilo dobro. I ljudi nisu pomogli i oni su bili vrlo ljubazni.
Koliko ste u stvari dugo godina pisali samu knjigu?
Altogether about 7 years, I suppose, to produce the book. And then last year, as you said, I went back to promote the paperback version of the book in English. And I was in Zagreb as well, promoting the Croatian version. And every time that I go back to Dubrovnik, I find that the place is more full of people, more full of life, but still as truly Dubrovnik as it ever was.
Kako ste naučili hrvatski jezik? Kako ste ga učili u stvari?
Well, I taught myself Croatian, and that's why my Croatian isn't terribly good. In England at the time, it was very difficult to find a good Croatian teacher. We're talking about the early 1990s. And so, I mean, I used books, I used tapes, but above all, I do have quite a good ear for languages. And so, actually, I found that my pronunciation was rather better than my knowledge, as it still is.
Na ulazu u grad, iznad vratiju od ploča, svojedobno je pisalo: ne prilazite nasilnici jer ratovi stoljećima nisu plašili ovu državu koja je mila duhu ostaljela svijet.
Imate pravo.
To je, ja mislim, vi ste isto tako završili vašu knjigu tim riječima.
Apsolutno.
To je očito poanta i poruka koja ima neki trajni povijesni smisao.
Da, apsolutno. Taj natpis ima mnogo značaja za grad i za mene. Because it's, to je ne samo povijest, ali nada za budućnost. Because it's also typically Dubrovnik that there is an legendary element, because although it is true that only in between the 13th century and 1806, the city was not directly attacked by other forces. Of course, these walls, these fortifications show that it was under threat, a very prolonged threat, and Revelin, that we're going to see, was built to meet that threat.
Ja predlažem da pođemo još jedanput istim putem kojim ste vi jedanput prošli. Da vidimo grad na vaš način, kako ste ga vi doživjeli i kako ga vi gledate ponovo na istim tim mjestima.
Dobro.
Mr. Harris, dobro došli u Dubrovnik, još jednom. Imamo novih dokumenata za vaš rad.
Dobro.
Vi ste u knjizi spomenuli Novulsa, ali ste samo ga u Mitića susreli. Ovdje je original tog dokumenta kojim se on obraća Dubrovačkom senatu i predlaže da bude konzul za dubrovačke trgovce, jer zna dobro talijanski, a i sam je trgovac. Osim toga, živio je u kući Davida Majstra, poznatog trgovca iz Dženove, koji je također bio dubrovački konzul i živio je u Dubrovniku određeno vrijeme. Sad imate original kod sebe.
Vrlo zanimljivo. You know that Knowles was writing from Falmouth, which is my own hometown. I don't think he was successful, actually, in becoming a consul, but it's extremely interesting. I'd never seen that. Well, look, we've got just a small number of the other documents that you've got from this enormous collection. You've got, I think, 100,000 separata and 7,000 registers in this collection, which is by far the richest collection that you'll find on this side of the Adriatic, without which we wouldn't just know about the history of Dubrovnik, we wouldn't know about the history of Serbia and many other places. And you've got some magnificent documents. Now, this next one here, of course, is the Statute of Dubrovnik. 1272.
Very important for your topic.
Indeed, and this is absolutely, of course, the fundamentals of the Dubrovnik state. But it's worth remembering that Dubrovnik was the only community which received anything like this degree of autonomy. I mean, of all the Dalmatian towns, and I think one has to ask why. And I think it was because even under Venice, by the end of the time under Venice, they had actually gained a great deal of control over their own affairs. They weren't just some other Dalmatian town.
Prije 13 godina, kada je u Dubrovačkom arhivu Robin Harris počeo s upoznavanjem povijesti, ali i s gradom danas, od neprocjenjive su mu pomoći bili i mnogi Dubrovčani i sami poznavatelji grada i njegove povijesti. Tako je i ponovni susret s gospođom Pavom Brajlo bio ujedno i prilika za razgledavanje nekih od najznačajnijih mjesta koja su obilježila povijest Dubrovačke Republike.
Kako ste, gospođo? Ne, samo nekoliko minuta.
Well, I thought I was running late.
To nije važno.
Nije važno.
Vrijeme je odlično, apsolutno odlično. And this building also, it represents us that very typically Dubrovnik mixture of what is of Christianity and morality in Christianity and hard-headed commercial realities.
Yes.
Because actually we have the names of these of the saints on these different storage units.
Yes, up to the first floor, all over.
And we have here this extremely significant inscription. Basically, I would translate it as our weights neither deceive nor are deceived. And when I weigh out merchandise, God also weighs me. And that really,
be honest.
Yeah, be honest because you're going to suffer in hell if you don't.
Yes.
But honest also because the atmosphere and the requirements of the city, this mercantile republic, require it, that it should be so. And it's a good thought.
It's a good thought, admonishing.
Yes, and for all time, really.
Dobar dan.
Dobar dan.
Ja ću po dubrovački prvo gospođu Paulu. Dobrodošli.
Dobro jutro.
Drago mi je. Meni je drago da ste ponovo došli u Knežev dvor.
Hvala lijepa.
Izvolite.
Well, we're here on the upper floor of the rector's palace now, in front of the entrance to the Great Council, and above this entrance, and I'm going to translate it into English, I'm afraid, what it says is forget private matters and stick to public ones. And this really was the philosophy of the Republic. Although it was, you could flourish as an individual in the Republic, you were not expected to be an individualist. And they did not welcome individualists. They wanted everybody to concentrate on the public good. And an example of this is that the only statue ever erected during the time of the Republic was to somebody called Miho Pratsat, who was a very wealthy and successful and generous captain, well, more than that, a merchant from the island of Lopud. It's a very modest statue, and it is significantly to a commoner, not actually to a noble.
Širom svijeta da te slave puti, živom vjerom u vitru i puti. Svuda nedelja da moj glas, svijetu samo u Kristu je spas. Svuda nedelja da moj glas, svijetu samo u Kristu je spas.
Catholicism was crucial to the identity of the Republic of Dubrovnik, and for very good reasons. Not just because everybody was devout, I'm sure not everybody was devout, but because it was first of all a great cultural and political bridge with the West. And Dubrovnik wanted to keep on looking west because it needed protection from the West. It needed, its great protectors were the Pope and the Catholic kings of Spain. And so that was very important indeed. But it was also a way of stating its identity against the near almost exclusively Orthodox Slavs of the mainland. In fact, one could say that Dubrovnik of the day was a Catholic island in a sea of orthodoxy. And beyond the Orthodox, of course, from the 15th century was the Sultan. It was the port. Of course, the Orthodox were well favoured by the Sultans. And the Ottomans were generally less favourable towards Catholics, but by its skills and its usefulness, Dubrovnik managed to overcome that problem. One should always remember that Ragusa, Dubrovnik, was a Catholic state. But it was a Catholic state which did things in a very Erastian way. It was a state not just Catholic. Well, this may be officially the second church of Dubrovnik, but I think for all Dubrovčani it's the preferred, the most beloved church of Dubrovnik, St. Blaise.
Dobrodošli, gospodine Harris. Dobrodošli u našu crkvu Svetoga Vlaha, o komu vi tako lijepo pišete. Idemo mi pogleda našeg Svetog Vlaha. Vi znate da je ovo srebreni kip pozlačeni iz 15. stoljeća. A u Dubrovniku je ljudima drag što on na svojoj lijevoj ruci, a to znači na srcu, drži grad Dubrovnik. I to je onaj najljepši grad koga znamo iz povijesti, to je gotički Dubrovnik sa onim prekrasnim tornjevima i rasporedom zgrada kakve su točno bile i može se danas ponoviti i utvrditi da je to zaista tako grad bio građen i raspoređen.
I danas je oblačno, vjetrovito, kišovito. Nije baš tipično vrijeme za ovo doba godine u Dubrovniku. Meni to više sliči na vrijeme u Londonu, u Engleskoj.
Možda. Ali kod nas znate da bi bilo mnogo hladnije, ponajviše u Londonu. I kod mene u Cornwallu olje su vrlo oštre nego ovdje, ali mislim da ovo je dosta za nas danas.
Recite, vaš ponovni susret ovih dana s Dubrovnikom, kako to doživljavate? Emotivno ili samo kao povjesničar?
Yes, well, I think that the most important different aspect for me is that I've concentrated so much in a short time, remembering all of the different aspects of Dubrovnik's history, linking them all together. And of course linking them also with the physical circumstances of the city. I've never had such a concentrated dose of Dubrovnik emotionally and intellectually as with you during this program.
Inače, odavde se pruža jako lijep pogled na vašu omiljenu crkvu u Dubrovniku. Gospa od Danača. Neobična je, kao na jednoj pustoj hridi. To me podsjeća na onu Vojnovićevu ili Osatovu, znate. Dubrovnik plovi, ponovo ište pustu hrid da bi na njoj sakrio svoju slobodu. Ovo je lijepo i neobično. Sakriti svoju slobodu.
To nije neobično. Mislim da what he's driving at is that Dubrovnik had to pretend not to be free in order to remain free, because freedom attracts the attention of unwelcome people who want to rob you of your freedom, rob you of your wealth. And there were a lot of people, both from the hinterland and overseas, who wanted to rob Dubrovnik of that. I mean, Dubrovnik had to cover it up and keep it secret to some extent to maintain it. Well, here we are on an exact replica of a galleon, and it has been raining and it probably will continue to rain, but it's interesting to remember that one of the first examples of Croatian written in Dubrovnik is in the margins of the 1277 customs, the Duane statute, where it says, and I'm going to translate, it says, here am I, abandoned in the middle of the sea. The waves are wetting me, and the skies are opening with mad, dashing rain. So, well, it isn't dashing rain, but probably it will be soon. Anyway, the galleon was a number of sorts of ships that the Dubrovnik merchant fleet had. There were the smaller ones, like the Gripo. The Gripo was most associated with these, the uskoks, who used it for warlike purposes, but obviously the Dubrovčani didn't. Then we come up through Caravela, Brigantina, Galleon, and Caracca, which is used for all of the biggest ships. Well, the high point of the Dubrovnik merchant fleet is in the 16th century. And by the 1560s and 70s, Dubrovnik had about 180 large ships in its merchant fleet, and that was probably as much as Venice did, which is an extraordinary achievement when you think of the relative difference in size and power of Dubrovnik and Venice. In the 17th century, the Italians, who certainly didn't know much about shipbuilding, but they knew quite a lot about merchandise, the Italians thought in the 17th century that the Dubrovčani were, with the Portuguese and the British, the best builders of big ships. That is quite extraordinary, because we British and the Portuguese, we're Atlantic nations. We're used to dealing with, I don't know that I'm used to dealing with, but anyway, as a race we're used to dealing with extremely tough weather. But here in Dubrovnik, where the weather is generally, I'm glad to say, rather calmer, they were able to build these magnificently seaworthy ships. Carmen, kako ste?
Baš lijepo da vas vidim.
Hvala.
Cijeli Dubrovnik priča o vama, ovih dana. Ali moram vam reći, imam jedan dug prema vama. A to su fotografije sa...
Fotografije?
Je, sa promocije lani koje smo imali.
Prošle godine?
Je.
U Kneževom dvoru?
U Kneževom dvoru.
Točno.
Tako. Evo.
Što imamo?
Imamo jako lijepe fotografije.
Čale.
Ja sam nešto vama poslala 2 komada, meni se čini samo mailom, ali ovo je ostatak koji sam čekala da vas vidim.
Velika hvala.
Nema na čemu. Ok, adieu. Hvala lijepa.
Hvala vama.
Okay, adieu.
Hello. Good evening. Okay. I've read your English edition in Canada, so I'm buying a Croatian edition from my parents. And these are their names.
Sa poštovanjem. Evo.
It's a splendid book, Mr. Harris. I was very impressed with
Very kind of you. This book had to cover over 1,000 years of history. And inevitably, therefore, most of it is going to be chronological. You've just got to follow the story through. But if you follow the story through just year by year, all the way through, you won't actually ever have the opportunity to cover subjects like society, culture, economy, art, the political institutions and so on properly. So part of the way through, you've got to find a division. Despite the 1667 earthquake, there was continuity. I mean, this strange, small city with its political institutions endured century after century after century after century in a way that very few states, even large states, have actually managed to endure. I mean, that is a remarkable characteristic. And the other side of this thing with continuity, I think, is coherence, that every bit of this society fitted into another bit. You know, so that the art fits in with the culture, the architecture fits in with society, so everything has its purpose and its place. And of course, the more centuries that you have of history, the more coherence you get. So in other words, Dubrovnik is all of a piece for a very long time. That's how I would actually describe Dubrovnik as being different. I mentioned the continuity and I mentioned the coherence, but I think that the other aspect is simply the sophistication, the refinement, the degree of development, I suppose to use a horrible modern word, that one finds from such an early date in Dubrovnik. I mean, it is extraordinary that, something like 6 centuries before Britain abolished the slave trade, Dubrovnik had in 1416 abolished the slave trade. Not incidentally slavery, but the trading of slaves up and down the coast. It's extraordinary that, 4 centuries or so, perhaps more than that, before we actually started to build up some kind of social state, a welfare state. I mean, Dubrovnik had its own doctors employed by the city, who were not allowed to charge, incidentally, for their services. Most of them were foreigners, and that probably made it easier to control them. But it had its own hospital, it had its own orphanage, it had its own very sophisticated sanitary arrangements so that people wouldn't die of plague from the filth in the streets. And from the 13th century, it was being absolutely clear that where everybody's responsibilities lay. And then on the other side, of course, there is the cultural and aesthetic elements of Dubrovnik, which are an expression of its sophistication, its art, its civil and military engineering, and its town planning, incidentally, and the way I find it fascinating, the way in which a particular conception of how a town should be organized and the institutions in a town, the city, I suppose I should say, are actually transferred to each little bit of the Republic. For example, in Ston, as you know, you can find a plaza, you used to be able to find a fontic, you can find arsenale, you can find absolutely the whole thing. So there is an idea that the Dubrovčani had of Dubrovnik, which they developed, they held to, and they imposed throughout the Republic. I think that's really quite dramatic and quite impressive.
Što u vašem ukupnom historiografskom radu znači bavljenje poviješću Dubrovnika? Kako je to iskustvo? Kakvo ono ima značenje za vaš budući rad?
Well, Dubrovnik was the most difficult work of history that I've ever had to write. Mainly, of course, because of the language. I mean, if you can't actually read the books to begin with, it's a bit more difficult than if you can. But I think that probably what Dubrovnik did was, you see, I'd started off my life as an historian as a medievalist, which is extremely useful because so many of the great centuries of Dubrovnik were during the Middle Ages. But actually, of course, Dubrovnik, you start at the earliest times, and you go right through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Counter-Reformation and so on, and and you finish up at the present day. And so actually, as a matter of fact, I started off really in life as being a medievalist, and now I think I'm more of a modernist, so that my last, most recent book, as you know, was a biography of Talleyrand. And the first time that I came across Talleyrand, I must admit, was actually when he was foreign minister in 1806, deviously plotting and planning the fall of the Republic of Dubrovnik. So if I'm a modernist rather than a medievalist now, I think we have to blame Dubrovnik.
Rekli ste da su stari Dubrovčani znali uživati u životu, da su znali pronaći mjeru i sklad, da su bili sretni. Recite, može li se u današnjem ovom suvremenom svijetu uživati u životu? Da li se može pronaći isto mjera i sklad? Da li se uopće može biti sretan u ovom jednom razornom relativizmu današnjeg vremena?
Well, that's quite right. Certainly, if you had a bit of money, I wouldn't like to say if you were right down at the bottom of Dubrovnik society. If you're at the bottom of any society, life's not much fun. But basically, I do think that if you had a bit of money, and I don't just mean you were a member of the nobility or something like that, but if you had a bit of money, the values and institutions and the circumstances of the Dubrovnik Republic did actually make for happiness. Because there were, well, apart from the fact that it's extremely beautiful, I mean, extremely beautiful circumstances, I think, make us happy a little bit. But also the values of Dubrovnik can be summed up, I think, by humanism. Humanism that is an appreciation of what makes life of value, an avoidance of excess, variety, keeping things at a human scale. I mean, Dubrovnik is the classic case of human scale. And I would say that it was also Christian humanism.
Da, hvala vam lijepa, ali još bih vas htio upitati nešto. Kažu da svi oni koji su se bavili, pogotovo duže vremena, poviješću ovoga grada, da su postali njegovi zatočenici. Možemo li vas ponovo očekivati ovdje kao povjesničara ili samo kao zaljubljenika u grad?
Well, I can't come to Dubrovnik without being an historian. In a sense, I am an historian, so whenever I come to Dubrovnik, I am interested in learning more and more about the history. It's a kind of sort of disease that I have caught, and historians are always rather odd tourists, because when everybody wants to go and look at a view or they, do something useful, they actually want to shuffle around and look at some inscription or something, and so I shall always be like that. But for me, Dubrovnik, well, it has a special place because, of course, I spent so many years thinking about it. And I found, actually, when I came to Dubrovnik this time, probably because of the concentration on the history and so on, that this is a completely unique place for me. And I can never come here really just as a tourist. And perhaps I may even, before the end of my life, which I hope won't be tomorrow, I might even come here for a rather longer period.
Kada sam kupio ovu knjigu u Londonu, u knjižari, rekao sam sada još samo moram pronaći autora da mi da svoj potpis. Ja mislim da sam autora u potpunosti našao, samo mi još nedostaje vaš potpis, pa bi vas molio.
Vrlo rado.
like to kindly invite Mr. Harris to present a short address to the audience.
Cijenjene dame i gospodo, to mi je velika čast i radost prihvatiti ovu nagradu grada Dubrovnika. Zahvaljujem vama i svima koji mi su pomogli za vrijeme mog rada i mojih boravaka ovdje. Ponosan sam i sretan ako sam bio, tako reći, dobri i efikasni instrument za boljeg poznavanja vašeg najljepšeg i najdražeg grada. Hvala.